This is Jennifer Gonzalez welcoming you to episode 208 of the Cult of Pedagogy podcast. In this episode, we're going to get a better understanding of what the secret sauce is for deeper learning in schools. Ask most adults if they remember anything they learned in high school, and what you're likely to hear is a lot of different versions of no. Ask most high school kids if they remember what they learned last year, and you'll probably get the same answer. Although exceptions certainly exist, it's not a stretch to say that a lot of what happens in schools doesn't really qualify as deep learning. In a lot of cases, what happens in schools today doesn't look much different than it did decades ago. Seat work, memorization, and regurgitation of a discrete body of knowledge and skills. Students who are successful are the ones who have learned how to play the game, while everyone else falls short in one way or another. As educators, we have been able to describe this problem for a long time, and many teachers in schools have attempted to change it by implementing new strategies, changing curriculum, sometimes building whole schools designed to create more opportunities for rich, authentic, relevant learning. So, what's working? Which of these approaches are getting results? What are they actually doing in places where students are engaged in deep learning? These were the questions today's guest asked over 10 years ago. Sarah Fine was a graduate student at Harvard Graduate School of Education, where she and Jal Mehta, an assistant professor, decided to go on a sort of quest, a nationwide search for schools that had created environments where deep learning was happening. While they were surprised and disappointed by what they found, they were still able to extract the secret sauce, a kind of formula for cultivating deep learning in any classroom. They shared their findings in their 2019 book, In Search of Deeper Learning. And in this episode, Sarah Fine sits down to talk to me about what teachers and school leaders can do to bring more of that secret sauce into their learning spaces. Before we get started, I would like to thank EverFi for sponsoring this episode. Everyone remembers that teacher, the study hall teacher who walked you through your first college application, the social studies teacher who taught you what taxes were and how to file them, the math teacher who used student loans to show you how interest worked. You can be that teacher, and EverFi wants to help you make that kind of impact with free digital lessons for K-12 students. From budgets and banking to credit and savings, you'll find a financial literacy topic that's right for your classroom. And especially during April, Financial Literacy Month, there's no better time to equip students with smart decision-making around finances. Learn how you can share these free resources with students and give them a financial foundation that lasts a lifetime. Just go to cultofpedagogy.com/everfi. That's EVERFI. Support also comes from Giant Steps. Designed to be engaging for students and effective for educators, Giant Steps is a brand new gamified practice experience for your classroom. With Giant Steps, you can boost collaboration and independent practice, gauge growth on the fly, and leverage free standards-aligned content. Create your free account today and explore a new world of practice possibilities at giantsteps.app. That's GIANTSTEPS.app. Now here's my conversation with Sarah Fine about deeper learning. Sarah Fine, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So just before we started recording, I was telling you that I started reading the book that you and Jal Mehta wrote a couple of years ago called In Search of Deeper Learning. And I was really fascinated by it. And then COVID hit and I just got completely derailed like everybody else did. So I think that what you all uncovered in the writing of that book was really valuable. And I would like to just share it. And so ultimately, we're going to talk about that. But since it's now been a couple of years, I'm also going to ask you, have things changed? Have they evolved since then? So let's just start with a quick introduction. What are you currently doing now in education? And then take us back a couple of years to what you were doing at the time you all wrote this book.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, I'm sitting in my office in San Diego, California right now, at the High Tech High Graduate School of Education. So for the last 6 years, I've been working here. The project of that 6 years has been building and designing and then running the San Diego Teacher Residency, which is a deeper learning focused teacher preparation program out of this graduate school. So that program is my baby. It very much reflects my attempt to put into practice the learning from that book, as well as other learnings I've encountered in my career as an educator. So I work with baby teachers all day long. We call them baby teachers. They're not all babies, but the new generation of folks who are going into classrooms and who are really interested in trying to disrupt schooling as we know it, and are excited to do that work from day zero of their careers.
Give us a quick overview, just what is High Tech High? You're at the teacher graduate school, so that's a
Yes.
separate entity, but it's part of it.
Yeah, it's related. The High Tech High School Network, it's a network of K-12 charter schools around San Diego County. They began in the year 2000 as a project-based learning model, open to all. And they have spent the last 23 years building out that model for students all around this region, and also trying to be sort of an incubator and an inspiration to educators who are doing similar work in other places. And the graduate school, we were the first, I guess the scholars out there call us these NGSEs, new graduate schools of education, that have popped up around the country that are not associated with big R1 universities, but instead have grown out of practice and out of folks who are just learning a lot about the work of teaching and learning and are ready to try to formalize that at the graduate level. So, High Tech High Graduate School began in the year 2007, and we received full accreditation several years after that. It took a while because we're an unusual institution. So we now are fully accredited GSE. We have multiple master's programs. We have a number of grant-funded initiatives, most of which are doing what I said before, which is trying to help other educators incubate new school models, new ways of teaching, new
Mm.
ways of thinking that are not necessarily the same as high tech, but are after some of the same goals. So we have the privilege of working with folks from all around the country and all around the world, in some cases, who are trying to really change how schooling is done
Mm.
and rethink what we want to happen inside of the walls of a school.
That sounds like such incredible and satisfying work. Take us back now to when you and Dr. Maida first formulated this idea for In Search of Deeper Learning. What were you hoping to do? And then what did that research look like?
I'm going to take us back to 2009, which is when
Mhm.
Jal and I first met. I was fresh out of 5 years teaching at an urban public school in the District of Columbia. And he was a junior professor interested in educational policy. And the thing that really sparked the work that became our book was both of us feeling like the focus of the past decade there, so the first decade of the new millennium, which of course was No Child Left Behind Act, passed in 2001, the sort of rise of the test-based accountability movement, the standards movement. Both of us felt like while that era had brought some important new focus to the work of equity, in particular, like really forcing educators to think about achievement gaps by subgroup.
Mm.
That also there was something that had gone really wrong,
Yeah.
where there was just such a myopic focus on test scores and foundational skills and literacy and numeracy measured in these very narrow ways. And I had experienced that as a teacher, working in a poor urban public school with Black and brown kids, whose achievement was very low based on those metrics. And so we basically spent all of our time trying to help them pass the tests. And Jal had seen that from a policy and sociological perspective, thinking about the ways that the pendulum tends to swing back and forth over time between sort of more aspirational, progressive aspirations for schools and sort of tighter, more top down, foundational, skill focused reforms. And both of us were like, look, there's been some stuff that's useful come out of this era, but also we've lost sight of what matters, which is that kids go to school and really thrive and feel supported as whole humans and feel like there's not a ceiling to what they're being asked to do, and there's lots of different ways to do it. And both of us really were reacting, I think, to the NCLB era when we started the project. And so what we decided to do was to go out and find some schools that were not as fully in the throes of standardized testing obsession, and try to figure out in the pockets where schools were trying to pursue more ambitious goals with
Mm.
kids and really think about thriving more holistically, what does that look like? What does it take? What are the challenges? So that was the beginning of our project. We were coming from really different backgrounds, but with a very similar sort of um, conclusion about what had been happening.
Okay. So, and you looked at a couple of different sort of archetypes, I guess, of schools that fit certain models. You gave them pseudonyms, so there's nobody knows what they are, but they definitely fit particular models. And ultimately, and then all of these schools in some ways sort of sold themselves as we are doing things differently here.
Yeah, yes. In our book, it looks very neat and clean, like, oh, we went and we found four different types of schools. The actual work of finding schools that we found to be rich, productive places to learn from was messier than that. We sort of went
Mm.
out thinking, oh, yeah, well, we just need to find the places that are doing this kind of work well, in particular for kids who are not from high socioeconomic status backgrounds, and we'll just embed ourselves and learn from them and write up these case studies and share them with the world in hopes that the conversation might begin to change. And what actually happened was the first couple of years was a lot of disappointment for us, frankly.
Mm.
I think we went out thinking that, and we continue to think that we could learn a lot from practice, and that didn't change. But the thing that did change was we thought there must be whole schools, maybe even whole districts or systems of schools that are really pursuing lofty goals and making a lot of headway. And if they're innovative enough and disruptive enough in their models, then we're going to see something really different in classrooms than what
Yeah.
we know often happens. So we spent a bunch of time getting names of schools and places that were known for doing that kind of work, and we bought plane tickets, and we
Hmm.
spent time away from our families. And as it happened, it was a lot more complicated than just, oh, these places have the answers, and we can capture them. The places we went had really profound learning and teaching happening in some pockets, and also were subject to the same patterns of like low level tasks and kids who were bored and kids who were sort of treated as like brains on sticks, as one educator talked to us, rather than whole humans. Like, we found that everywhere, even in the most quote unquote innovative spaces, even at places that we were really excited to go to because they were
Mm.
doing things differently. So that just opened up a whole new set of questions for us, and also over time shifted the way that we were going about the work, which was, rather than being like, there are great models, we'll find them, we'll write about them, it was more like, under what conditions, in what pockets of these places
Mm.
is there promising work, and what can be learned from those pockets. So that's where we landed.
I when I got to that part of the book where you all were sort of talking about the disappointments, I really admired that that was the direction you took with the writing of the book, as opposed to just being like, well, let's scrap this, or let's just pretend that our original goal was something else. I've loved that you were completely transparent about, because that's science, really. This is what we set out to find, and this is what the actual reality was. So here it is. And you just ended up shifting what you ended up delivering, which was sort of an extraction of what are the conditions and practices that actually make for deeper learning. And maybe it would make sense for us to also sort of pause and define how did you all decide what you call deeper learning? Because we sort of
Yeah,
danced around it a little bit,
yeah.
but is there a definition in the book?
There is, yeah. And there's, we also spent many, many pages that are, it's probably better to read them in summary, trying to draw in the many different traditions that influence the way we think about
Yeah.
deep learning, because we are far from the only ones who have thought about that. In the book, we kind of ended up distilling deep learning to three domains that, when interconnected in the experience of learners, tend to produce really powerful, rich, enduring learning. So one of them is the domain of identity. So
Mhm.
when learning experiences, when kids see what is happening in school as connected to who they are, what they know, and maybe what they want to become,
Mhm.
um, there is something very important that happens there. So we talk about the difference between, I am somebody who goes to chorus at 10 a.m. on Tuesdays, to like, I am a Glee Club member, I am a musician, I am a singer.
Mm.
So there's
Mhm.
something about the process of, as over time, as you do something, it becomes more and more core to your sense of self in some way. The shift from math class to I'm a mathematician, or I'm a mathematical thinker.
Right.
So there's that piece. And I would argue that piece actually is foundational. Like if you have to start somewhere, start with identity, start with figuring out what kids want to know, what they care about, what they already do know and wonder about the world, who they might want to become, and see if you can use that as a launching point. So that's identity. We also think about deep learning as involving some amount of we call it mastery. I also think there's other ways that we could describe that, but the idea is like really rich, developing really rich conceptual knowledge and ability to execute something in some domain. So skills as well are part of mastery, but um, actually being able to do the work of a discipline, to think in the ways that that field or discipline require, having some foundational knowledge that is can be seamed together to think in the ways of that tradition. So you have to know some stuff and learn some stuff and
Mm.
gain some skills. It's not just about accessing motivation and so forth. And we really connect our notion of mastery to traditions of scholarship that are about rich understanding and conceptual understandings, like getting how something works, not just knowing a bunch of disconnected stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, for example, understanding the role of the human heart in the body is not just about being able to label where the human heart is on a diagram or being able to spit out a definition. It's actually systems knowledge that's connected to other pieces of knowledge. So mastery is really important, and we saw a lot of instances where mastery was an incredibly important part of a kid's process of learning. And then finally, creativity. And we think about creativity as not just receiving knowledge, but being able to produce knowledge and act on the world in some way that is doing something. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not just creativity in the sense of like the arts, but it's more like, okay, you know something about the human heart. Try to design an artificial heart based on what you know about what the heart needs to do, or just the idea that kids can do a lot, and they really wake up to their own possibilities when we give them opportunities to actually use their knowledge,
Mm.
and use their knowledge to produce something novel or something that has utility to the world or meaning or beauty or something that hasn't been done or made before. And too often we don't see that in classrooms, but when we do, it's just incredible what happens
Mm.
for kids. And finally, those three domains, so creativity, mastery, and identity, we see them as interconnected, right? So, like, the more
Mm-hmm.
you know about something, the more you might start to see yourself as somebody who has a relationship to that thing. And creating something in a domain similarly might change your sense of self. Like, oh, I'm not just somebody who can solve a math problem on paper. I'm somebody who can use math in the world to solve an engineering problem. And I did, in fact, and here's what I did. So
Yeah.
they're not separate from each other. There's a kind of like interconnected nature where they're all engaged in some way.
So those three domains would sort of help us to define what deeper learning looks like. And then what you found, unfortunately, not whole schools and whole systems that were nurturing this and making it happen on a regular basis, but you did find it in pockets. You found it in individual classrooms. It sounded like you especially found it in what you called the periphery, in elective classes, in extracurricular activities. Um, and so from all of these observations, you were able to sort of pull out characteristics in the ways that those classes were taught that made it more possible to pursue the deeper learning. So what were some of those things? So what we're thinking about now is a teacher listening, thinking, how can I make that happen? What were those teachers doing that made that deeper learning possible?
You're so good at talking about our work. I feel like we should hire you. I often lead with what you just said, which was that one of our sort of false assumptions at the beginning was that to find deeper learning in schools, we should just look at academic classes, and instead,
Mm,
like you just named, over time, it dawned on us that actually a lot of the most powerful learning that had those three qualities that I just described
yeah.
were at the periphery, were places like elective courses, extracurriculars, things that happen that are happening, within school spaces or are within a school's purview, but in fact are often not paid attention to by policymakers, by parents, by funding streams. All, nobody talks very much about what's going on in those spaces, and yet they were the places where we saw the richest learning happening. Not every single one, but
Hmm.
on the whole. So yeah, so we over time started to try to understand what is the secret sauce here that governs these spaces that's making them so much more promising as places for identity development and the development of mastery, and the producing of novel
Hmm.
work. And the way we have written about it and talked about it in some places is that there's just a different set of underlying assumptions and structures that are undergrad spaces, like elective courses and like extracurriculars. And we talk about it as like the grammar of those spaces. And we're drawing on work from David Tayek and Cuban, who talked about the grammar of schooling, which includes things like, lockers and 35-minute periods and 7-period days and, separation of disciplines, all the sort of assumptions and structures that are common in secondary schools. So this other domain has a really different grammar. So if you think about places, for example, we wrote a chapter about an after-school theater production.
Hmm.
And, I would invite anybody listening to substitute a school newspaper, a school orchestra, a sports team, an elective course, because we found these same qualities in different places like those as well as in this theater production. But first of all, there's choice. There's like kids are voting with their feet. And I think there's a powerful, important connection to identity there. Like kids who are choosing to do theater either already think of themselves as kids who are good at or interested in theater, or it's kind of trying on a new identity, like,
Hmm.
oh, that this is something that might call to me in some way. I'm not sure yet, but I want that. So there's meaningful choice. There are opportunities for real apprenticeship learning in those spaces. So kids are learning from each other. There are leadership roles that are distributed. Kids who are more experienced or older are often in charge of supporting kids who are less experienced or younger. We saw this in the theater production where there's a lot of kids coaching other kids, kids who have
Hmm.
done other theater productions, helping the newbies to find their feet and so forth. Lots of kids giving critique to each other in productive ways. So there's a kind of decentering of adults as the only ones who can carry knowledge and
Hmm.
expertise. There is also a sense that roles are interconnected. So like in a normal academic class, usually it's like, every kid is doing the same thing at the same pace, for the same purposes with the same test at the end of the week. Whereas in a place like theater, different kids have different domains of expertise. There are kids who are good at the lights, kids who are good at the
Hmm.
staging, kids who are painting the set, kids who are doing the acting, kids who are helping pull it all together, make sure those things are coordinated. So there's room for kids to get good at different things and to lean into their strengths and not have to be good at everything. But also, they all have to work together to produce something that
Hmm.
not any one of them could do on their own. And that's true, think about like a school newspaper or a debate team. This is
Hmm.
true of a lot of these places. It's like,
The
it's not
football team,
everybody.
even. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. A
Yeah.
sports team. Not everybody's going to be, um, not everybody's going to be the quarterback, but you
Right.
need a really good quarterback, and then you need other kids who are good at doing other
Yeah.
things to help pull it all together. And so
Hmm.
there's something where rather than this kind of independent, meritocratic, individualistic way of approaching learning, it's actually no, we're trying to produce something important and
Mm.
new and big, and none of us can do it alone, and we can't do it if we're all doing the same thing at the same time. We actually have to rely on each other's brilliance and skills, and we need to find a way to coordinate those things in order to mount this production. And that's just a really different way of structuring a learning community than
Hmm.
what core academic classes do. And I would argue it actually runs against a lot of the cultural norms we have in our country in a very exciting way. It's like, no, we don't want cookie cutter people
Mm.
who all have the exact same skill set and can all score the same thing on the same test. No, we need a lot of different people who know a lot of different things working together productively to
Yeah.
solve problems or produce things that are bigger than any one person can do on their own. So that was present. And then finally, there was an authentic audience for the work. Like the kids are doing something that is not just going to be turned in to their teacher at the end of the day, right? If you're
Hmm.
and having an authentic audience doesn't just raise the stakes for the kids, it also means that the standards of quality come in part from the response of the audience to what you're doing. So like if if you worked for 3 months to make sure that the parts of the theater production that are supposed to be funny are funny, and then the audience doesn't laugh, well, you have some feedback in real time right there
Mm.
about in this case, the lack of efficacy of your choices, but also vice versa. Like if the audience laughs when you expected and planned for them to laugh, you're getting feedback that you're having the desired impact on
Mm-hmm.
your audience, that whatever the production, the vision you had for the production is successful. So I think the authentic audience is really important for two reasons. One, it's because the stakes are higher. It feels more real, it feels more authentic. But then also, it means that there's some feedback that is coming not just from a teacher or from a score or a Scantron. It's actually feedback that's tied to the like standards of the field.
Right.
And
Right.
you don't have that as often as we would like in core academic classes.
So, but you did see some deep learning in the core academic, because as I'm listening, I'm thinking if I am a US history teacher, a lot of the characteristics that you described, I'm thinking, how do I do that in my class? But did you see deep learning in
Yes.
like a history class, and what did it look like there?
Absolutely. We saw, I think the bad news was we didn't see deep learning as consistently as we would like in the kind of shining star cases we originally picked. But the good news is we actually saw learning that had many of those qualities everywhere, and not just in schools that were like, fancy design-based, project-based schools.
Mm,
So I just want to put a point on that like the things I'm going to describe happen everywhere every
mm,
day, and
mm-hmm.
teachers have found their way to figuring out how to make this happen, which is there's a lot of assets we have in our system that I think we could be leveraging. So yes, we saw, as it happened, we saw a lot of core academic classes that were the most powerful ones had very similar qualities to the ones I just described. So, for example, in humanities classroom, I'll use as an example, we saw teachers, number one, who are able to allow students meaningful choices, even though they weren't ultimately choosing to be in the class the way they were choosing to go to a
Mm,
theater production. So a lot of agency on the part of students to decide where to go deep, what to, in the context of project-based learning, what topics they might tackle. Um, a lot of sort of decisions about like, well, what are you most curious about and why, and how can we jigsaw the learning in this space so that different kids are responsible for different segments of learning. So, for example, if you're in a history classroom where you're studying revolutions and trying to come up with some theory about why revolutions happen,
mm.
you have different kids who might, for different reasons that could tie to their identities and their curiosities and their background, pick different revolutions to study. And I think no choice is too big or too small to be consequential to kids.
What you just said though, that sounds already so different from I think the way starting by saying we're teaching about revolutions which spans over centuries versus we're going to cover the American Revolution, and
Yes,
and so that's a
yes.
very essential question way of approaching it versus a covering of the content way of approaching it.
That's exactly right. And I think all of the classes that we saw, regardless of context, academic classes where there was real richness and depth, teachers had found ways to make that shift,
Mm,
asking good questions that could be explored in a variety of ways.
mhm.
Um, rather than their orientation being like, we need to march through this curriculum in
Right.
lockstep.
Yeah. And did they, if we stay with this revolution example I'm thinking, is this a teacher who had to buck up against their system and say, "No, I'm not going to teach history the way you all have insisted," or I've heard of some teachers who say, "I'm going to do it my way and we're going to figure out a way to squeeze in all the other requirements somehow so that on paper we've at least done the bare minimum of what it said." Like is it more like that, or were they able to get systemic change to happen in their curriculum?
I think it's both. I think that teachers in the U.S. work under a pretty broad range of constraints. Some teachers work under very heavy constraints. You're alluding
Mm,
to that, right? It's like
mhm,
pacing guide,
right.
PowerPoints. On day 72, you need to be on this page of the
Yeah.
textbook. And of course, if you're working in a system that is that constrained, your ability to be creative it's there, but it's more limited. But there's a huge range. There's many teachers who work in systems that are much more loosely regulated than that.
Mm-hmm.
They may have a textbook that they're supposed to be working from and some sort of district assessment that happens periodically. But to your point, there's actually a lot of wiggle room, more wiggle room than a lot of people might think, to
Mm-hmm.
kind of play within it, to choose to go deeper in some places and shallower in others. And I think you're absolutely right. We saw teachers who were being very creative about making that space in their classrooms,
Mm-hmm.
without totally going off script from what was expected of them.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's teachers who work in systems that are almost unconstrained, right? There are systems where, yeah, at the end of the year, kids need to show that they've done something that's related to U.S. history, but it's really up to you to get there.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, and that has its own challenges because some teachers don't know where to start, but also
Yeah.
has a huge amount of opportunity in it. So absolutely. I was going to say also that just to stick with the revolutions example, I think that there's also an orientation that some of these deeper teachers had around connecting past to present in ways that activate kids' identities. So,
Mm.
we did in fact see a social science humanities project on revolutions where one of the questions was like, are we on the brink of a revolution now? Right?
Mm.
Let's understand. Let's use the past to understand the present and make sense of our lives around us, the world around us. It's a compelling question. It's an important question. It's one that real people, real adults are asking themselves. So, how can we go deep, not just to go deep, but also to make sense of something meaningful for ourselves beyond school, just as citizens in the year 2023? It's an important question. So
Right.
I think that is tied to mastery, right? Like you need to learn something and know something about the structures and patterns that have characterized certain historical moments, but also it's tied to identity. Like, what am I living through right now?
Right.
Right now, how do I make sense of what's happening? Where do I want to What's my agency? Should we be having a revolution? If we wanted to start a revolution, what would it look like? What would we
Right.
do? What role do young people play? Like there's just so many ways in that are not about, getting a grade, getting a score on a test,
Mm-hmm.
getting the
Mm-hmm.
GPA, checking off the fact that we finished that chapter of the textbook. There's just a totally different way of thinking about it.
Right. Did you, so I'm thinking about maybe another subject area like in math. What would constitute sort of creating something for an authentic audience? Did you see any of that in math classes where it was really they got buy-in from the kids?
Math was hard. I'm not gonna to be totally transparent. Math was sort of the final frontier in some ways. So the answer is
Mm,
yes, and I'll get to that. But I do want to name that um, it took us a long time to find math classrooms that had that sort of identity, creativity, mastery combination
yeah.
that we were looking for. And I think that the traditions and the supports for the teaching and learning of mathematics are like even more like the status quo is even more powerful, and the
Yeah.
lack of imagination about doing something different is even more extreme than in some other subjects. So we didn't see a ton of conceptual or creative or student-centered mathematics in a lot of places. It was generally like very algorithmic math. I'm going to show you how to solve this type of problem. Now you try to solve this type of problem. Now go home and do some for homework and, so
Yeah.
forth. And so we actually ended up going to see a couple of schools that did math via the Harkness method.
Mm,
Harkness is it's a sort of Socratic seminar
right.
style way of thinking about sort of discourse, like discourses in the
Right.
Harkness method. Basically, it's all about discourse. It's all about verbal conversation and deeply
Right.
unpacking things. So we went to a school that had Harkness math tables, and basically a big seminar table in the middle of a room and whiteboards on each corner, and the teachers would just pose a question, a mathematical question, often that it could be answered through a variety of different mathematical disciplines,
Mm-hmm.
geometrically, algebraically, and so forth. And kids, because they'd been in the system for a while, knew that their job was to explore first. So it wasn't the teacher saying, here's how you do this problem, now do it. It
Right.
was, here is this problem. What are some different ways you might approach it? So it started with kids just grappling with a lot of
Mm.
open ended support for, like, can you draw the way you think about this? Can you write it out in numbers? Can you come up with words? What are some different ways we might think about it? What's important in this problem? And just a lot of verbal conversation and sense making around mathematical questions. And eventually there might be some mathematical modeling of, like, a standard algorithm, or like
Hmm.
something that, but it was, first of all, there was just much richer discourse. You don't usually hear kids talking much in math class
Right.
about math, at least.
Yeah.
And it was rather than a kind of I do, we do, you do gradual release model that so many teachers have been trained on. It started with a, like, y'all try it and see what
Right.
happens. And now let's have a discourse. Let's share our different strategies and ways of thinking about this problem together. And
Hmm.
now the teacher might infuse a little bit of expert knowledge, but not in a way that would shut down the conversation, just in a way that could move it forward.
Mm.
And now let's try a similar problem and see where this has all landed us. And so it was very much more conceptual, less focused on, learning algorithms and applying them, much more about, like, the sense behind the math. And then we did see some project-based math classrooms where mathematics was done in the ways I was describing, but also connected to consequential questions that kids were exploring about, a problem in the world. Maybe they were working on statistical modeling of a social
Mm.
science dilemma, or, you know, writing data stories that were connected to something they were working on in their humanities classroom. So there's definitely examples out there of
Hmm.
math being taught and learned in ways that are more powerful and
Yeah.
more conceptual and more connected. They were very hard to find. I just want to come back to
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So, as you sort of wrapped up your research and pulled these ideas, what did you ultimately recommend to individual teachers and schools that get the message and they're looking at their own teaching and saying, I need to make a change? What would be some places where people can start to make the learning deeper in their classrooms?
Yeah, we always get asked that. I have so many thoughts about that. It's hard to know where to start. I have two. We tend to have two places we would advise folks to start, and where we've seen examples of
Mm.
really powerful teachers saying, "This is how I began the process of
Yeah.
transforming my practice." So one is around having an authentic audience for whatever work the kids are going to be produced, like starting at the very end of a unit or a project, or whatever arc of curriculum you might imagine. The difference between turning something into your teacher and then getting a grade, and performing or sharing that learning with an audience that is not just your teacher,
Mm.
is really profound. And there's some work on, like, hierarchy of audience, right? So at very least, having kids share their work with each other, that's a starting
Mhm.
point.
Mhm.
But more than that, have them share their work with other members of the school community, other grade levels, maybe at an all school assembly, right? Have older kids write storybooks to teach younger kids, and then they go and do it. Or you can leverage what's already inside of the school.
Mhm.
You can also, if you want to go further, leverage, like, an external audience, right? So invite community members in who have a stake in the questions you are exploring, who might be experts on the thing that you're working on. Maybe you're working on a policy dilemma, trying to understand it, that's relevant to policymakers or community members, or just voters. Bring those folks in to share your work with, or mount a performance, a theater performance, or a music performance, or something, or put it up on the web for the world to see.
Mhm.
There's all kinds of ways to think about audience, but I think the moment that you start thinking about the work that kids are doing being seen by others, you open up an opportunity for more motivation.
Yeah.
But also you start to, I think for teachers, it starts to raise the stakes. Like, oh, it's not just me who's going to see their writing. Like, they're
Right.
writing for the local newspaper. Like, that's a reflection of my teaching and not just on them.
Yeah.
So I think that is a really, really powerful way to start. And actually, in my own early years teaching, when a colleague and I decided together to have our students perform some of the poetry they were working on at an all school assembly, which is, it's not that hard to do. It's not as hard as, like, mounting a theater performance at a local community theater or something.
Mm.
It changed everything for me as a teacher as well as for my students. It was like, no, no, there's going to be other eyes and ears on this. how you do is a little bit of a reflection of how we do as a whole group and so forth. So I have a little bit of firsthand experience at that. There's some shifting of the lens that happens just with that audience
Right.
change.
Right.
And then the other piece is like, as much as you possibly can, try to find opportunities for depth over breadth. Like marching through a curriculum just to cover it, I don't think there's many teachers out there who actually enjoy or believe in doing that. There's a lot
Mm,
of teachers who feel bound to do it and they feel constrained. But Joel and I talked to so many teachers who had a really like high level of hunger to do things differently. They just didn't feel either able to imagine what it would look like or supported
mm,
to try it. So I think teachers have a lot more, a lot of teachers have at least a little bit of wiggle room to try to
yeah.
be like, okay, we're just going to do less. But what we do, we're going to go deeper and I'm going to allow for more choice. And I'm going
Mm-hmm.
to, think about how kids can really master, I don't love the word master, they can really build deep conceptual understandings of something rather than making it to the end of the chapter or whatever it is.
Right.
So
Right.
so I think that like slowing down piece,
Mm-hmm.
I'm hopeful that there's more and more school administrators who are making it safe for teachers to make that decision as well. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's something administrators could do is to message to educators like it's okay to slow down and go deeper. Like I will sanction it, I will support it, I will defend you if there's criticism. Like I
Yeah.
think that as well just opens up a lot of new lines for good work.
You just said something about a minute ago that I think is a really key piece of this, which is that they want to do it, but they don't know what it would look like. And I think that is such an important part of getting more people there is models of here's a teacher who's already doing it. This is what it looks like. This is what a semester looks like in their class. This is what a week looks like. And actually seeing it because then people go, oh, okay, I can do that same
Yeah,
thing instead of having to just
yeah.
start from zero and figure it out. Where would people even go to find that kind of modeling? I mean, I know this is what I try to do on my site is put a light on people that are already doing it, but
I'm so glad you said that because I think like sometimes people talk about the absence of deeper learning as like a policy problem or a
mhm,
pedagogy problem and all of that is true, but I think you're right. I think it's an imagination problem
mm,
at its root, that we have a system that has failed to provide a lot of examples that help people imagine something different and see what it might look and sound like and experience it themselves. Well, I think that, I mean, I'm surrounded here at High Tech High, and we are far from the only folks out in the world doing good work, but by people who are doing really interesting work. And there's a site, Unbox Learning, that I will not
mm,
ashamedly promote because I think there's examples of really powerful student and teacher work there, in the realm of project based learning, but also beyond it, that just start to, I think, inspire some sense of what's possible in schools. I think there's various organizations that have popped up recently that I'm thinking about, like what schools can be, what kids can
mhm,
do. I mean, there I
mhm,
think is an emerging coalition of folks who are not just calling for deeper learning, but actually trying to like surface and elevate and
yeah,
make visible examples that are already out there. And then I think the really hopeful thing that Jal and I found was even in the most traditional, generic, sort of non specialty schools, there were teachers who had made a lot of headway toward doing
mm,
powerful work with kids. And so I think that norms of isolation in schools are a problem in this front. I think if
mm,
teachers could get into each other's classrooms more often, I think if you do that enough, you're almost like bound to encounter some practices and some examples of the type of teaching and learning you yourself might want to be doing. So, um, I think it's nice for people to like, fly across the country to High Tech High and Big Picture Learning and all these, schools that are designed differently. And I think there's a place and time for that. But I also think, if you're a teacher working in a 2000 kid building, like there are bound to be a lot of colleagues who have figured some stuff out,
yeah,
that you
I
yourself
agree.
are trying to figure out. And if you can just get out of your room, and I know it's hard, it's easier said than done, and get into some other classrooms and just start to like absorb some of what you see, I think that that's a really powerful starting place
Mm,
as well.
I agree, especially if you see some of the same kids that you teach interacting and behaving and engaging in such a different way in
Yeah,
someone else's room, it's like,
yes.
oh, maybe it's the methodology and not necessarily the kid who's,
Yes.
disengaged.
Well, and to circle back to what we were talking about earlier, I think like if you're a core academic teacher, go to an art class, go to a music class, go to an
Mm,
elective. I mean, and rather than thinking, oh, well, I have a textbook and they don't, so I can't do that. I think the mentality should be, what is the logic and the stance here, and how can I bring that into my
mm,
room? As given the constraints I work within, because you're absolutely right. Seeing your own students come to life just across
yeah,
the hall from your own classroom where you feel like you're wrangling them all the time is
yeah,
just, it can be disheartening. But I actually think if you flip the lens, it's actually really exciting. It's like, no, it's
yeah,
not the kids, it's the
right,
conditions, and I
yeah.
can try to change those conditions. So
Because I'm thinking, yeah, an art class could have a textbook that somebody decided we're going to make sure you cover all these artists, all these periods, and that the kids just sit there and, it could be taught that way. But in most places, it was decided, no, we're going to have them do stuff instead.
yeah, right,
So,
right.
yeah. Since the book was published in 2019, we've obviously had massive changes in the world since then. Has your thinking evolved any? Have you, in terms of what you all recommended, has anything changed for you?
Certainly. I'd say more subtly evolved than, massive changes and revisions to what we did argue. I think that one thing the last number of years has really brought to mind even more sharply is like the importance of well-being and wellness in
Mm,
schools as a component of deeper, richer, powerful learning experiences. And Jeff Duncan Andrade has a new book out where he really pushes hard on this in a very powerful way. But schools that prioritize well-being, defined very broadly, I think um, are setting a foundation for kids to thrive intellectually as well as social, emotionally,
mm,
and physically. And schools that are not, schools that are still really thinking about, well, when they go to math class, their brains, but when they go to recess, their bodies, and, when they go to
mm,
advisory, their souls. So I think the pandemic pandemic has been awful in so many ways, and I don't want to sweep it away, but I do think that it has forced a lot of educators and school systems to think about well-being and kind of mental health, brain health as a component of what
mhm,
kids carry with them to school, as well as trauma and so forth. And I'm cautiously hopeful that that lens is not going to disappear as the pandemic hopefully fades into the distance. That we all kind of had to reckon with how important a filter all of that is for kids learning in a
mm,
way that I don't think we had before. So I'm hopeful that that is going to get sort of built into the way that schools and systems work more fully than it used to. And it's important, but it's not just about like having more school psychologists on hand, which of course the pandemic has opened up funding for and so forth. But it's about teachers, like academic teachers, every person in the building thinking about, how do I help these kids be well and like
mm.
be present and feel able to learn and feel connected. And those have been important questions from the get go, but I think the pandemic has sharpened that.
I agree. I agree. Where is the best place for people to find you online?
I'm pretty active on Twitter. I think a couple months ago I was afraid Twitter might go under and it's my only social media, but it hasn't yet. So until it does, I'm at Sarah M. Fine on Twitter, and I love connecting with other educators and folks who are just interested there. I'm always willing to engage. And then my workplace, High Tech High Graduate School of Education, we have upwards of 5,000 visitors a year coming through the system here, and I love just when folks show up and I get a chance to learn from them and talk with them and show them what we have going on here and see what that sparks for them. Not because everything we have going on here is perfect, but I think it's a good conversation starter. So we always welcome visitors. I love guests.
And you're in the middle of your annual conference right now. Why don't you go ahead and pitch that too, so that people know if they're really excited about this, they can even look at that.
Yes, the Deeper Learning Conference. It's a little late because it's starting in an hour, but I'll pitch Deeper Learning
For next
2024.
year.
Yeah, it's a 3-day event put on by the High Tech High Graduate School, but we have about 1,500 folks from all over the world who are like-minded and who have a chance to teach as well as to learn here. It's not us presenting, it's lots of peers in the space running all kinds of really cool stuff. And it's not, we're trying really hard not to have it be like a conference capital C. Like there's music
Mm.
and there's food and there's dancing and singing and movement and people out in the world creating things and building things. And we're try to model the kind of experiences we want to happen in classrooms. So it's not a sit and get. If you want a different kind of conference, I think it's a great opportunity for folks.
Fantastic. Sarah, thank you so much for giving me this almost hour, basically. We had some tech issues, so it actually has turned out to be
Yeah,
an
my
hour.
pleasure. Oh, it's so fun, Jen.
I appreciate it so much. For links to all the resources mentioned in this episode, visit cultofpedagogy.com, click podcast, and choose episode 208. To get a bi-monthly email about my newest blog posts, podcast episodes, courses, and products, sign up for my mailing list at cultofpedagogy.com/subscribe. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great day.